All right, in 3, 2, 1. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Jeff Frick here, coming to you from the home studio for another episode of Work 20XX. And I'm really excited about this episode. You know, there's people that have been in this business and remote work is hot, but there's other people that have been studying and really investing in better workplaces long before COVID, long before kind of the current trends. And we're really excited to welcome in, via the magic of the internet, one of the OGs. I think she was recently introduced in another show. She's Kate Lister, the president of Global Workplace Analytics, joining us today from Carlsbad down by beautiful San Diego County. So, Kate, great to see you.
Great to see you, Jeff.
Absolutely. So is it a beautiful day in San Diego
Yeah.
today? No?
No, we're just about to get a thunderstorm,
Oh, my goodness. Well,
but we need the water.
let's jump into it. I can't help but think of people like you and Adrian Rowe and some of the other workplace professionals that I've met along this journey, and this kind of whipsaw thing where, you know, you guys were out ahead of the curve years ago and some of the benefits and some of the opportunities afforded by distributed work and remote work. COVID hits overnight with no prep. Everyone is suddenly thrown into this thing. Over 2 years pass with a lot of new data, a lot of, thankfully systems in place that weren't necessarily there before. And now suddenly 2023, early 2023, when we're recording this, the return to office mandates are coming back, and we've kind of shifted from this great resignation to the great layoffs. I think it's going to be the great reshuffle. Just kind of take a breath. I mean, this kind of a whipsaw last couple of years that you've been through.
It kind of feels like Groundhog's Day, actually. We just keep having the same conversations over and over again. I dug out a report that I did in 2012, and I could practically just dust it a little bit and issue it again.
Yeah. Well, let's talk for a minute about the research and what you guys have and what you do at Global Workplace Analytics, because you're all about first-person research and you're all about data. So give a quick overview of what you guys do and how you do it.
Yeah, I started out as a banker, and I think that always gives me that C-suite perspective. And so when I first got involved in this about 18 years ago, it just struck me that nobody had made the business case, made the financial case for why remote work, telework, as we called it then, was good for companies and good for people and good for the planet. And so I set about doing the research to quantify that. And the more I looked at it, the more I became convinced that this is just something that has to happen. Before me, there was a couple decades of people also pushing that rock uphill. So, this has gone on for 3 decades now. And, were it not for the pandemic, I think we'd still be growing at that ripping pace of 10% a year.
But what was the focus before? Was it mainly the cost savings? Was it mainly the opportunity to expand your TAM, for your talent pool? So kind of pre the modern digitized work tools that we have today, what were some of the leading drivers even back then?
Well, it's been a pendulum. It's kind of the solution to the problem du jour. So if it's talent shortages, then, then that's the focus. When we go through a recession, when the economy gets bad, it tends to be focused on cost savings and the potential to reduce real estate costs. Sustainability swings in there sometimes. Unfortunately, not as much in the US, but certainly in Europe. To reduce gender mixing in some Islamic countries, in some Asian countries, to be able to keep their talent local and not have to lose them to the big towns and cities, and they can take care of their elders. Just a whole host of reasons, but primarily it's been cost savings and talent.
Right, and talent. And now we've had, basically the promise of untethering, is finally kind of here with cloud and cloud-based applications and super fast handsets. So I think that was a really big change. And then two, so much work now is digitized, so that you can, kind of log in wherever you are and get back where you were and get those tools. You really think about the office used to be the place where your file cabinet was. I mean, that was where the work was, and that was where the printer was, and that was the only computer that you had access and internet capability. It's really interesting to think that we haven't moved it away from that mentally, a lot of people, when, those tools have all basically been rolled up into our telephone.
Yeah, but let's not forget that they were doing this 20 and 30 years ago. Call centers were one of the first to move in this direction. We were probably using pagers back then. And in the federal government, it's actually been a mandate since the year 2000 that every federal worker is supposed to work from home to the maximum extent possible. And in their case, it's for continuity of operations in case, say, a pandemic hit and people weren't able to go to work.
Wow, I didn't know that regulation. Well, let's address some of the just simple kind of 101 challenges. I had as guest on a great show with Richard. He just went through the basics. So I'm going to give you the basics, but you got the benefit of a lot more data than I have. So first off, let's talk about culture. And people think you can't have a culture if people aren't hanging out in the office. And I think one of your great lines, and it's something I watched getting ready for this, right? I think you're 9 floors, 9 miles, or 9 time zones away, right? People have not been sitting next to each other for a long, long time. So what's some of the data say about culture when some proportion of the workers are remote or distributed?
Yeah, that's something that we hear a lot from the C-suite right now, that they're worried that they're going to lose a sense of culture. So often, companies are making decisions based on gut, based on feeling. And the research points to the exact opposite. Culture is one of those. Gartner did a study that showed that culture was in the decline long before the beginning of the pandemic. And that in some ways we substituted the physical workplace as a proxy for culture. Those pictures on the wall of all the grand things that we're doing, we're supposed to infuse us with culture, when culture is really about people. And it's about how we interact, and it's about trust. In fact, the research shows that employees largely feel that culture has improved since the beginning of the pandemic. They got to know the CEO sitting in her armchair, and got to feel closer to them. People that felt they didn't have a say in the office because they were introverts, because they were neurodiverse, because they were shy, whatever reasons, they couldn't break into the conversation when we were on calls. Now they have all kinds of opportunities. We can we can include them through polls. We can include them through chat by putting their hand up. They feel like they've had sort of more egalitarian with all of those same size squares on the screen. I mean, that's what culture's about, is do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I'm being listened to?
Yeah, and I think it's such a big piece of this is, freeing up time from the mundane, from the monotonous, from the garbage, by automation, through digitization, through asynchronous and other ways, so that you free up time and, even more importantly, energy and focus for one-on-one meetings, and increasing the frequency of human connection, even if we're not necessarily in the physical proximity, and really focusing on the communication aspects of culture rather than the physical location or the beautiful painting up on the wall.
Yeah, I mean, minorities, for example, are more likely to work from home, or more likely to want to work from home, as well as women, because they feel like they're avoiding the microaggressions. Those microaggressions are part of the culture.
Right. Another big one people like to talk about, productivity, right? Hot topic. And, a lot of people still managing tasks. Some people are managing objectives. Some people are basically giving a charter permission to run and asking, how can I support you in your journey? A lot of different takes on productivity, what to measure, what not to measure. How are you seeing, again, what does the data show in all those thousands of research reports you guys have in your back pocket?
I couldn't show you one study of the hundreds that I've read that shows people say that productivity has declined. And that includes managers and employees themselves, where a majority say that it's declined. The majority do say that it has increased. And that's true of both managers and employees. But again, it's that CEO sitting there saying, I feel like productivity has declined. Well, that's always my first question to a client. Well, how do you know? I mean, have you measured it? Did you measure it before? Are you measuring it for the people that are, sitting in the office? the highest time shopping is around noon on a weekday before the pandemic. So how did that work out? We've known since the 50s or maybe even earlier, Maslow. People want to be given the opportunity to do their best, given the tools they need to do their best, and then given the autonomy to do it. And that's what people got during the pandemic. And that's why they're balking so bad about giving it up. It's about trust, and it's been about trust since Jack Nilles invented the term teleworking in 1973.
Right.
1973.
Right.
It's that managers simply don't trust their employees to be untethered. And they somehow substitute seeing the back of their head as some measure of productivity.
Right. And you would think 2 years past the beginning of this thing, of the COVID era, business has been functioning for 2.5 years. And as is often expressed, and that wasn't a planned rollout. That wasn't necessarily something that we had resourced for and trained for, and yet that a lot of the companies kept clicking along. So why do you think the productivity narrative continues to hang around? Is it just the last vestiges of gray-haired people like you and I are that are holding on? The other great line I like to hear is the only people that want the work to return back to the physical whiteboard are the people that used to hold the pen.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
I picture the typing pool with the guy on the balcony, looking at all his minions being busy. We're past that. We're knowledge workers now, and you can't manage knowledge workers in the same way that you can typists. But you bring up a good point. We didn't do the things that we should have done to make this transition. If I was working with a company prior to the pandemic, we would have spent 6 months to a year rolling it out in some kind of organized fashion, with training, with change management, with a cross-functional team of HR, IT, real estate, and sort of done it right. We didn't do that, and we've had 3 years to do it since, but we kind of, at least for the first 2 years, we were in triage mode. We're going to go back. We're going to go back. We're going to go back. It's always 3 months away, right? So we never put those foundations in place to actually, change the practices and processes in a way that makes us most effective. There's still a lot to learn, and the companies that I'm working with now have realized that. We have to train managers to manage by results. Most managers, I think that's true. Most managers are just promoted out of a job that they were good at, and they may not be good at management.
Right.
And they need training for how to use the tools, for how to, in particular, how to be equitable in a distributed environment. We need to be very careful not to create a second class of employees, those that are remote, who don't get considered for promotions, who don't get the best assignments, who 70% of managers say they would prefer people in the office for promotions and compensation considerations and those kinds of things. That's very real. And we have an opportunity to take the good things that we learned during the pandemic, those, how to engage people, how to bring the voices into the room that weren't in the room. We really need to focus on that.
Right. Okay. Another hot topic that comes up all the time is innovation. And how do you drive innovation if you're separated? And to me, the innovation secret ties back to psychological safety. Really directly, and I don't think a lot of people tie that together, because I think the behavior in the middle is risk taking, and it's the response to risk taking which is going to drive more risk taking. And I think innovation is a simple math game in a lot of ways. If more people are taking more risk with more data, not the risks that are going to bring the company down, but trying things with the confidence that a lot of those things aren't going to go right, then guess what? You're going to get innovation. You're going to get more people applying their processes, their brain power to more data to experiment, to hopefully drive that innovation.
Yeah, you nailed it. It's about trust. The other, all of the research points to the fact that innovation is a two-part process. It involves creativity and innovation, taking that creative idea and turning it into a commercial opportunity. And creativity happens best when we're alone, right? When we're in the shower, when we're in the car,
right.
we're taking a walk. That's where creativity happens, and ideas are not best vetted in groups, but they're often vetted in groups. There was a couple of recent research reports. One was from Harvard that showed that people feel like they come up with more creative ideas when they're in groups. And they do, they come up with more creative ideas. But when they come up with the ideas as individuals, they come up with more commercially potentially successful ideas. So it's, again, this feeling, it feels good. It feels better when we're innovating in a group, but we're actually more effective when we're not. The one thing that did come out of the research in the pandemic is that our weak ties got weaker and our strong ties got stronger. And we need both for innovation. So the strong ties are the people I work with every day, the people in my unit, people on my team. But the weak ties are those people that are in a different function, in a different location, that have a different perspective. That's what really, triggers the innovation process, is having those different minds together. And so we need to be, it doesn't mean we have to throw it out, right? Like, remote work's no good. We need to be more intentional about how we cultivate those weak ties. And in some ways, we can do it better virtually.
Right.
Because,
I was going to say it's the opportunity for weak tie creation and engagement is stronger than it's ever been, right? We have so many of these digital tools that we could reach out and touch each other. I mean, we touch each other through an instant message, I think, on LinkedIn. The tools are available. I guess it goes back to my favorite Darren Murph word, right? Is intentionality, and actually thinking about these things and not expecting them just to happen because you show up in the room. And it's very odd that it's still so mysterious that this intentionality piece is so critical.
Yes, it is. It is kind of weird.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
I have to temper myself sometimes when I'm, starting with a new client. It's like, really? You really think that?
Right. And then let's just double down on the DE&I, because there's so many elements to that have been empowered. You've talked about microaggressions. We've talked about a lot of times for flexibility. It's flexibility in time, not necessarily in days. A lot of time that has to go back to caregiving, whether that's caregiving for the kids or caregiving for the parents or caregiving for somebody in between that needs some help. And so that flexibility, as well as kind of the microaggression thing, has really been a huge impact on underrepresented groups and their ability to really feel like they can contribute and not necessarily face some of the negative things that were a downdraft on their productivity.
Yeah, exactly. And I worry that, I guess one of my biggest worries is that if we allow that divide to occur, the remote and non-remote, and we know that minorities are more interested in working remotely and women are more interested in working remotely, then we're just going to increase that gap if in fact managers are treating those people differently, not giving them the opportunities for promotions and for compensation increases and for the best projects. So it just, again, it goes to intentionality. It's funny, there's some tools coming along, right? You can have a haptic watch that tells you we haven't heard any minority voices in the room. We haven't heard any women's voices in the room. Did you know that you've done 40% of the speaking during this meeting?
Right.
To sort of coach people. So maybe that's going to be the answer. But the fact that, we know that there's strong evidence to suggest that a company that the more diverse it is, the more successful it will be. And now we have this global opportunity to hire people, the best and the brightest from wherever they are, and bring those insights in. We talk about innovation. That's what it's all about.
Right. Can you speak a little bit on some of the specifics about mid-manager training? What are some of the tools and techniques and some of the easy wins? Because, what's kind of tricky is, the world's moving very, very quickly, but also their managers didn't necessarily grow up in this world, so they can't really look upstream to try to get advice and tips and tricks because they weren't working on Slack and they didn't have mobile phones and they didn't have remote teams. So what are some of the things, I'm a willing and able and happy to do this manager, but I just need some help.
Yeah. Middle managers are really caught in the middle of all of this because you've got a senior leadership that's largely resisting, and you've got your people who largely, want to increase this flexibility, and you've got to serve that mandate. So they're really stuck in the middle, and the biggest skill they need is to learn to manage by results. And if we're not managing by results, then we're just babysitting. We're just watching people work, which unfortunately during the pandemic became even more prevalent to have these surveillance systems that, watch my face and count my finger strokes and all of that. Just absolutely crazy. So how to set goals, how to give people the tools and the space that they need to meet those goals, and then how to step back and be a coach versus a here's what you need to do manager. That's the biggest one. There's a lot about communications and using asynchronous communications, which is also a lot more inclusive.
Right.
I'm an introvert, so I keep coming back to that. We think more slowly, and so we're not the ones that are going to blurt out ideas in a conference room. But give me an asynchronous document that comes out of that meeting and allows me to give it some thought and then add to the document. That, again, it brings in a whole new voice in the room.
Right.
Those are tools that are not typically known by the middle manager. They're not ingrained.
Right. I'm curious, when you get a willing student who wants to do better, do they know what the real objectives are that they should be managing to, and have they not been managing to them, or do you just kick into a big giant hornet's nest where it's kind of maybe goals and objectives aren't that greatly defined for me and my team because I haven't had them passed down from on high. I can imagine it's very different if I kind of know it and I just need to refine my talent versus you're kind of pulling back the onion on some nastiness that we don't necessarily want to go to.
Yeah. Martha Johnson was the head of the USGSA. Oh gosh, it's got to be 10 years ago now when they redid their downtown offices, a historic building, into a one that recognized the ability to work remotely. And so they took a building for 2,500 people and eventually accommodated 4,000 people. And she just has a line that I love. Remote work doesn't create management problems, it reveals them.
Right.
The pandemic didn't create these management problems, it revealed them.
Right.
And so we've done a lousy job of cascading goals and sort of being on the same page from the leadership on down, so that one person that at the end of the chain, they know how they contribute to the organization. And that's what culture is all about, right? Believe in the values, and it has to come down, it has to cascade. Everybody has to understand that they're part of the bigger picture. There's a story about Kennedy walking into an office, John Kennedy, and saying to the custodian, "So tell me about what you do here." And he says, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." Right? That's what it's all about.
I love that story. I've heard you say that before because it really ties it back together. To your point, it has all three of the things. It has, what is the great mission? Right? I'm not here to be a janitor, just to be a janitor. I could be a janitor anywhere, right? So what's the mission? And then what's your contribution to that mission? And do you feel a connection between those? To me, the communication aspects of this whole thing to me are, way out front, way number one. But let's stick in the weeds for a little bit and talk about everyone's favorite topic, which is meetings. And you even said, and I think it's great observation, right? We need quiet time. You need time for your brain to think, and whether that idea comes to you in the shower or it comes into you after the shower, it's this combination of thoughtfulness. It's this combination of research and getting input from other people, and then just letting it bounce around a little bit and see what shakes out. And yet now we've got this other thing that we've inherited, this meeting culture, which is tied to synchronous, and it's tied to inefficiency, and it's, to your point, who's doing most of the talking and who's doing most of the listening, and not to mention what's the net cost of the time of all the people engaged in that meeting for that hour, and do they all really need to be there? Are people finally getting over the meeting culture of the last several years, which generally has not been very good? I forget who it was that just went in and wiped the slate clean of hundreds of thousands of hours worth of meetings a couple months ago. And it, start from scratch with Slack, or it made them in Spotify or somebody.
Spotify, that's what it was.
But it's a really toxic meeting culture. And when they're back to back to back all day, how's anyone supposed to get anything done?
No, I mean, it's just so stressful. And everybody hates them. It's so often a readout, one person in the room that's speaking and telling us everything. So why didn't you just put it in a memo? Or why didn't you, why didn't we record it so I could watch it later? And in fact, now that Chat GPT and these other technologies are coming along, I just read the highlights. Just give me the cliff notes. Or just give me this part, because I've been sitting through the whole meeting until you say that word, because I know that's the one that I'm supposed to be paying attention to. So that's, why waste all that other time? I mean, they're just totally broken. We just have to scrap them and start over. And in the hybrid mode, there's just so many things that we have to do differently. I was making a presentation, like a final presentation to a client, a Fortune 500 client, and we'd spent months and months and months doing all of those things to help them understand how to do hybrid better. So in this presentation, they were all in a room, lined up on a board table, and I was the only one that was virtual. And so we got to the end of the meeting, and I said, okay, I think we should rate this meeting. And I'm going to go first. I'm going to give it a 3 on a 10 scale. They're like,
on your own meeting that you're leading? That's that's pretty bold.
Because they had my presentation up, and they didn't have 2 screens, so they couldn't see me. They couldn't, get the gestures. I couldn't see them because they didn't have a camera in the room. I couldn't understand them because there was an overhead mic that, mumble, mumble, mumble.
Right.
And at one point they were having a discussion, and then we're asking, what ideas do we have for this? And I wanted to weigh in, but I couldn't break into the conversation. And so I wound up texting the chairman and saying, I'd like to contribute to this conversation. Just as some, at one point they got up and they all had donuts, and, here I am sitting with no donuts, and they turned off the sound and the video. So, I mean, I used that as an example. We've just, one of them said, well, didn't we just hire somebody to help us think about all these things? It's yes, but it's not ingrained. It needs to be taught. It needs to be intentional. And just tiny little things can make a difference. Having a buddy in the room, for example, if I'm remote, then there's somebody in the room that can speak up for me.
Right.
Getting used to using chat, because some people are better there. Getting used to using the flags, putting your hand up, being strict about who gets to speak. Sometimes people speak over that hand. Is that what we're going to do, or is that not what we're going to do? And just some little things like that to make it more equal.
Right. So Steve Todd from NASDAQ talks a lot about activity-based things and organizing around activity-based. And LinkedIn just opened a new headquarters. It's been a while now. Great Wall Street Journal piece where they have 75 different types of seating configurations in the same building. And so I know it's not your top of your list, but there are great things that can happen in a physical space. when we're together. And again, it goes back to this intentionality. And I think the great summary statement to me is, that the on-site is the new off-site, meaning when you organize an off-site, you have objectives, you have icebreakers, you have community events, you have hard work, you make the time together worth the expense of going to some expensive hotel or whatever. We're now really thinking about the office environment for those types of activities that are well done together, which is heavy collab or socialization, focus time. There might be a library in the back. So, kind of rethinking the times that we are together beyond just simply a row of open cubicles, which did anyone ever really like those in the first place? I don't know.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a fully remote advocate. I mean, it's hybrid is what shows worked best across the board. It's sort of the best of one size fits none,
Right.
or the solution to that. And so what companies are doing now is looking at their footprints and saying, okay, what do we need to do different? How do we earn the commute? That's not my line, but I love it. Because we need to do that now. And again, didn't create problems, revealed them. It revealed that the office was not a great place to be. We after the last recession, we crammed all the desks together and took down the walls and said, oh, let's collaborate. And what happened? Nobody collaborated because they didn't want to interrupt everybody else, and because it didn't feel secure. And so they're learning from that. I'm a little afraid that they're going to go too much the other direction. We had like a 70-30 split on individual space and together space prior to the pandemic. And, there are people talking about that's going to flip. The number one thing people want, say they would bring them to the office, was privacy, a place where they could have privacy. So, we can't forget that that's still a very important part of it. And you mentioned it, focus. I mean, the majority of the work that we do is individual work. It's focus work. It's something like 60%. I'm talking in big numbers, but it's different for every company. And that's why you can't be like Google and you can't be like Spotify. You've got to learn what your own mix is all about, and go to that and not just copy everybody else. But, I think it's activity-based work has been talked about being done in Europe for decades. They're much further ahead than we are. We were already headed there before the pandemic, and this has just accelerated it. And I think it's good. You need a place that you need choice, because we don't do the same thing all day long.
Right. Well, and even in the traditional offices, there was never enough meeting space, right? Never enough meeting space. You could never get a conference room. We needed a conference room either to take a private call or to get together with 2 or 3 people. So I think it will index pretty heavily towards these different types of spaces versus the individual space. And then you also have these younger kids, right, who grew up with Ubers, and kind of shared resources is not that strange to them. And also they never had photographs up on a wall, or a calendar up on a wall, or a calculator out on your desk, or a file cabinet. So a lot of these things that we kind of took for granted for being in our cube, I think it'll be interesting. I think there's so many more opportunities to be creative and rethink space. So to your point, not only make it worth the commute, but do the activities that are more productive in the office, including, isolation time, if you want to just do some crazy heads down work.
Yeah, it's happening. I'm seeing it happen. I think last year was actually a very slow year for a lot of people in the workplace strategy business like me, because companies didn't know what people were going to do, whether they were going to come back, how often they were going to come back. And we need time to sort of figure that out before we start shoving the walls around. The bottom line, though, has to be agility. However we shove those walls around, there will be a difference in the future. Things will change.
Right.
And we just have to, some people are putting their walls on rollers and their desks and, all the pieces, parts. It's like a Lego system, and you can just pull it apart and put it back together a different way.
Right.
That's part of this whole agility that we need to become not just familiar with. It needs to be ingrained in us.
So let's jump up a couple levels and talk about the macro demographic trend. Recently, China's population, I think, went down, right? Which I would have never imagined in my lifetime. A couple of years ago, India, I think, passed it. Japan's already kind of facing a crisis in terms of just not enough young people, just in terms of not having babies and people getting older. I mean, these are huge demographic trends that are big and really drive everything. We've gone through, recently a bubble, or excuse me, a blip. People have been getting laid off, but I think this talent shortage is systemic, and it's going to take automation, and it's going to take these things to basically be productive with the people that you can get. So when you think about talent, right, it's always the big three. How do you attract them? How do you engage them when they're there? And then how do you retain them? So this mythical measure of employee engagement, how are you helping people think about that, taking care of the people that they have in the building, making sure that they're engaged so that drives that retention, because it's maybe been laying off a couple of people yesterday, but they're going to be hard to get back tomorrow.
Yeah, and a lot of those people there's sort of an overhiring, and we're seeing sort of a normalizing there. But the talent shortages, not just labor shortages, the talent shortages are extreme. And the faster the technology changes, the more that we're going to have trouble keeping up. I'm a big fan of the work around internal and external talent markets. I envision a day not too far from now when I'm sitting here working on a PowerPoint presentation and my keyboard jiggles and it says, you're not very good at this. And by the way, it's also, a waste of your time. And you also know that we have 20 vetted contractors who could be doing it for you right now. And also, by the way, do you know that Jeff Frick has a wealth of research on this? He just did a symposium on it. We don't know what that talent mix is within the organization, let alone without. And during the pandemic, and actually since the last big recession, 2008, 2009 recession, there's been this move to the gig market that typically bounces back after a recession, but it didn't in the last recession. And what people found is that they liked the autonomy, that they were doing it because they liked being independent, and not because they couldn't find a job. And so it's not mature yet, but there are some companies that have adopted this whole strategy is you don't have a job. You work on various projects and you bid them, right? Internally, you bid them, but like you were a contractor. Can you imagine if you got to spend 80% or 90% of your day doing the stuff that you're good at?
Right. Well, Meg Bear at SAP at SuccessFactors, they have the similar type of thing, this internal market for jobs, and they have this concept of dynamic teams that Meg talks about. Right, it's like the A team. You bring together a group of people to solve a problem. Maybe they stay on that problem. Maybe they train the rest of the people. Maybe they go on to something else. But if you just think of making it exciting for people by giving them new challenges and new learning curves and new situations, it's not that hard to think that that's going to help people be more engaged, just because they're more intellectually stimulated, and we like problem solving, right? We like challenges. We don't think we like it, but we actually like the steep part of the learning curve. It's uncomfortable, but that's when you grow. So that's a really interesting concept that you brought that up, this kind of an internal marketplace to make sure. And as you said, even just sharing the information that's in the organization is so hard.
Yeah, it's that's not going to happen overnight either. But I honestly think that's where it's going. The fundamental part of that is that people get to do what they're best at.
Right.
And they get to cultivate those skills, and that we need to bring everybody skill level up. Unfortunately, we're seeing one of the first things that's going is training, as companies are starting to try to reduce costs right now. Bad move.
Yeah, that's
really
not a
bad move. That's going to be so fundamental to success in the future.
Right. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the future. And you brought up ChatGPT, and before we got on, Accenture just did their tech vision, and I think generative AI was one of the 4 big tech trends. And I've been digging into it recently. It's pretty innovative, and it's funny, the use case that you just described potentially could be solved with an internally focused ChatGPT. Hey, somebody please help me with this PowerPoint. I need some help. And, potentially that thing is going to answer the questions that you do. But as you think about not ChatGPT specifically, but just kind of reskilling and relearning in the pace of change and the way work is going to change at this really, really accelerating pace from a workplace perspective, how are you helping leaders think about these curves? Because we're just not good. We're just not good at these super steep curves.
And who would have imagined what November, the chat GPT was starting to talk about, and this is March, and it's
Right.
like the
Right.
biggest thing. I mean, honestly, I think we're looking at the invention of the vehicle or electricity. I don't think we have any idea where this is going. You mentioned Accenture. They onboard over 100,000 employees a year in a metaverse.
Right.
They don't see them.
Right.
And I find the gray hairs in the room just don't like this metaverse thing. No way. And myself, I hate games. I don't do video games. I don't play in that world, but I can certainly see how it would make a difference. And so, your question about how do you prepare people for that? You can't prepare them. That's the thing. I mean, the only thing you can prepare them to be is open to change. Right. Is not just open to change, but eager for change, and continuous learning. I mean, that's just, it's got to be ingrained in people's jobs. That part of your job is to learn.
Right. Well, the wrap on that, let's kind of bring it back to the culture and bring it back to leadership and bring it back to communications, because ultimately it's the people at the top that have to set the priority that we're going to be a learning organization. The marketplace that we dominate today or may not dominate today may not exist tomorrow. So we have to have the ability and the agility and the flexibility, or we're going to die. I forgot who said that, it's not the strongest that survives, it's the most flexible that survives. And if we've seen anything over the last couple of years, is that any pretense of stability is probably not very well founded. I mean, things continue to change at a rapid pace. And, you take the Silicon Valley Bank thing, that happened in the course of 48 hours. So kind of the whippiness of the curves, if you will, both the frequency as well as the height is just increasing over time. How do you help leaders say, we're talking about workplace, talking about remote work, but you need a much bigger, broader perspective on keeping your people and thriving in this crazy dynamic world?
Yeah, I know it's really hard for the senior leaders who have always done it this way, right? How many times do you hear that from a client? But that's the way we do it. And to get them to open their eyes to some of these new concepts is very difficult, but that's where it has to start. If I get a client and they say, no, you can't talk to the CEO or you can't talk to the leader, I can't work with them, because that's where it has to cascade down from them. And they've got to be committed to it, and they've got to be willing to fund it. They've really got to follow up that commitment. I like your idea, your concept of the whip. I'm thinking of, breaking the sound barrier with that whippiness of the innovation.
Well, yeah, as we started, I mean, I think if, like I said, you and Adrian, I mean, it was, you were pushing this proverbial rock uphill. I think you described it as then the rock started chasing you, and then suddenly we're at the bottom of the hill and people think we're going to go back up to back where we were. And it's like, no, we never go back to where we were. And it's interesting, even in technology, in the business of changing the world, everyone still thinks that we're in the place that it's going to end, except for the piece that I'm working on, right? Like, we think this is the end of the game. Like, no, it's not the end of the game. And the other thing that fascinates me is scale. What is fast? What is not fast? I mean, I just posted today that when I started work, we didn't have mobile phones and we didn't have fax machines and we didn't have a lot of things. And that was only about 40 years ago, right? So we say 1980 to pick a date. Is that a short period of time or a long period of time? To me, it seems like yesterday. And so to think what's going to happen over the next several years, and if you listen to some of the interviews on this ChatGPT, it's the delta in the computing power of the last 4 years that has really moved the needle. It's not the algorithms. It's the capacity to deal with the bigger N That's
And
really,
that's about to explode too.
and that just explodes exponentially, every single day. Today's the slowest day of technology advancement for the rest of our life, right? So
Yeah.
it's really, to me, it's almost interesting how it flipped it then back, that the advances in technology flip it now back to being human. And leading as a human and setting the mission and communicating and getting people on board and making them excited about where you're trying to go versus, are we on Slack? Are we on Teams? Are we
Yeah.
on WebEx? Or, it's really
I hope someday that doesn't
fascinating.
matter. I mean, there is sort of not one company, but it's just like it's there.
Right.
I also think holograms are going to become a part of our everyday life in a shorter period than we think.
Yeah.
But that rapid change thing, has to start at a young age, and so we've got to get it into the school system. We've got to sort of stop thinking about degrees and thinking about bringing up people for not a specific thing, but to be able to change, to be able to meld in whatever way is needed. Some of the big companies now and small companies aren't looking at degrees anymore.
Right.
They want to
Right.
know what your skills are. What have you done?
Right.
Makes a whole lot of sense. I think that's a step in the right direction, and where you are becomes in not part of the conversation now, that we can work anywhere.
Right. Right. Well, one of your great lines, use it all the time. People, planet, profits. I should say, don't flip it. Run this way, but unfortunately, it turns out profits often get stuck above the people and the planet. I love how you say that. It's so simple. How are you helping leaders think through? And I asked Dave Patrick from Schwab, and he's like, "Yeah, I know that double entry accounting, that doesn't work at Wall Street. There's only one entry, and it's at the bottom." Hopefully that's a little bit changing. But when you talk to leaders in terms of actually, if you focus on the people and you focus on the planet and the sustainability goals, especially as it's a corporate board priority, it will actually drive profit.
I show them with numbers. I show them the research. I show them that you can measure productivity. You can measure the impact of stress and mental illness and arthritis and whatever the concern of an individual is on how they perform, and how that then ties to how the company performs. There's this big controversy at the beginning of the pandemic. Do we give them an ergonomic chair? Right? So you could pay for 200 ergonomic chairs with one workers' comp claim.
Oh my goodness.
Right? Should we give them a dual monitor? You could pay for a dual monitor with 1 minute of extra productivity a day. It's just this no-brainer stuff. We've just got to have a longer scale thinking, which just isn't common to us. And you're right. I've already seen sustainability fall on the agenda because of the concerns about the economy. And things like taking care of your people, ditto. Seeing that fall. It's just a real changed mindset. I think ESG reporting, environmental, social, and governance reporting, is going to help move that needle. It already has in the E part, the environmental part, and the social part is also part of. What if you had to report your rate of turnover, your days to hire, your average employee performance ratio, your DEIB programs, how many training hours you give every person a year? What if that was in your annual report? And that's what sort of Blackstone was pushing for,
right?
Is that it should be, and in fact it will be, because that's part of the S. And there are like 3 or 4 or 5 organizations that are vying to define what is that S and how do we measure it. But we need to start doing that now, because it's going to happen.
Right. And business leaders will make more money. There's so many things we discover, right? It's like, it's not just
you
the right
fail
thing
on
to
the
do.
G and you're going to get scorched.
Right, right.
There's no getting away with something anymore.
Right.
The governance, it's just something you have to do.
Right. But that's the stick. Again, if on the positive side, what we find over and over and over again, a lot of these things that are the right thing to do, you actually get better outcomes, you get better business decisions, you get more profitable, you actually get all kinds of stuff. So, Kate, I want
to measure.
What's
We
that?
really need to measure.
Right, right. But that's why we have you and your 6,000 plus some odd reports to share this great data with us. That if even if you haven't perfected measuring it yourself, let me help you show you some other data and also help you guys do that measuring.
Yeah.
Well, Kate, thank you so much. It's this time has flown by very, very quickly. I want to thank you for your time and also for all the work you do. You're out all over the place on doing tons of podcasts and really getting the word out with data, which is so great because people need the data. As you said, too many gut reactions out there instead of paying attention to the numbers.
Well, thank you, and you're doing a great job of bringing that leadership to those thoughts to a bigger audience. So keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. So she's Kate. I'm Jeff. You're watching Work 20XX. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening on the podcast. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Okay, we are clear.
Clear.
You're great. You're a really good interviewer.